When 72-year-old Harold Mitchell saw the injured biker bleeding on the roadside, he had no idea the leather vest belonged to a captain in the most feared motorcycle club in America. 3 days later, 24 Hells Angels roared into his quiet town, engines thundering down Main Street as terrified locals hid behind curtains and locked their doors. But what happened next would change everything Harold thought he knew about mercy, respect, and the true meaning of brotherhood. So what did the Hells Angels captain do when he came face to face with the old man who saved his life? The morning mist clung to Highway 34 like cigarette smoke in an old bar, thick and heavy with the promise of another scorching August day in Millbrook, where the pavement already shimmered with heat waves despite the early hour. Harold Mitchell's worn work boots struck the asphalt in their familiar rhythm, the same steady pace he'd maintained for 37 years of walking to Miller's Hardware, his calloused fingers wrapped around a dented thermos that had belonged to his late father, filled with coffee so black it could strip paint. The smell of honeysuckle drifted from the roadside ditches, mixing with the distant scent of diesel exhaust and fresh cut hay from the Morrison farm, while Mirks called from fence posts that had witnessed more seasons than Harold cared to count. At 72, his daily walk had become both meditation and necessity, a quiet communion with the road that connected his small rental house to the job that had defined half his life, stocking shelves and mixing paint for neighbors who still called him young Harold. Despite the gray stubble and the way his shoulders curved forward like quotation marks around a lifetime of careful work, the screech of metal against asphalt shattered the morning silence like a glass bottle thrown against stone, followed by the sickening thud of something heavy hitting the ground and the sudden eerie quiet that follows violence. Harold's coffee thermos slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the shoulder as he rounded the bend to find chrome and steel scattered across the yellow center line, steam rising from the engine of a massive Harley-Davidson that lay on its side like a wounded animal. Beside the fallen motorcycle, a man in bloodstained leather struggled to push himself upright, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle while crimson drops spattered the hot pavement beneath him. The biker's face was a road map of hard, living weathered skin, a scar running from his left ear to his jawline, and eyes that held the kind of pain Harold recognized from his own mirror during those dark months after his son Tommy's funeral 15 years ago. The leather vest bore patches and insignia that meant nothing to Harold, but spoke of allegiances and territories, of a world where respect was earned through blood, and brotherhood forged in ways the hardware store clerk could never understand. "Sweet Jesus, son, don't try to move," Harold said, his knees protesting as he knelt on the rough asphalt, ignoring the way the hot pavement burned through his worn work pants. The biker tried to wave him away with his good arm, mumbling something about being fine, about not needing help from anyone, but Harold had already pulled his ancient flip phone from his shirt pocket while reaching for the clean handkerchief his mother had taught him to always carry. "Name's Harold Mitchell, and I've seen enough hurt in my time to know when a man needs assistance, whether he wants to admit it or not," he said, applying gentle pressure to a deep gash on the stranger's forearm. Feeling the man's muscles tense beneath his touch, the biker's eyes, green as bottle glass and just as sharp, studied Harold's weathered face with the weariness of someone who'd learned that kindness often came with a price. But something in the old man's expression, perhaps the same gentle concern Harold had shown Tommy during his childhood, scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks, made the stranger's defenses crack just slightly. "Marcus," the biker whispered, his voice rough as gravel, but carrying a vulnerability that surprised them both, and Harold nodded as if they'd been properly introduced at a church social rather than meeting over blood and broken metal on a lonely stretch of highway. The town of Millbrook had always thrived on information the way flowers thrive on rain, and news of Harold Mitchell's roadside rescue spread Through the community faster than kudzu. Climbing a telephone pole. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, who'd witnessed the entire scene from her front porch while watering her prize-winning petunias, became the unwitting town crier, carrying the story from her morning coffee with the postal clerk to her afternoon bridge game at the community center, where each retelling added new details about the mysterious biker's intimidating appearance and the blood-stained patches covering his leather vest. By evening, the story had reached Murphy's diner, where Harold's usual booth in the corner suddenly felt like a spotlight as neighboring tables fell silent when he entered, their conversations resuming in hushed whispers that followed him like shadows. The regular customers who'd known Harold since he was Tommy's age now studied him with a mixture of concern and bewilderment, as if his simple act of human decency had somehow transformed their mild-mannered neighbor into a stranger capable of reckless judgment. "Harold, honey, you sure you know what you're getting yourself into?" asked Dolores Murphy, sliding his usual coffee across the scratched formica table. With hands that trembled slightly, her voice carrying the worried tone she'd used when discussing the Morrison boys' drug problems or the Hendricks family's foreclosure troubles. Harold stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl like storm clouds, remembering how Tommy used to ask for extra whipped cream on his hot chocolate during those precious Saturday mornings before everything went wrong. "Dolores, I helped a hurt man on the side of the road. Same as I do for anyone," Harold replied. But even as the words left his mouth, he could feel the weight of the community's disapproval settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The same suffocating sensation he'd experienced during those awful weeks after Tommy's accident, when well-meaning neighbors kept asking if there was anything they could do, while secretly wondering if Harold's grief had driven him to drink like his father. Before him, the whispers followed Harold through Miller's Hardware the next morning, where customers who chatted easily about weather and local gossip now conducted their business with polite efficiency, their eyes avoiding his, as if kindness had become contagious. Even Mr. Peterson, who'd employed Harold for nearly 4 decades, pulled him aside near the paint mixer with an expression of fatherly concern that reminded Harold uncomfortably of conversations about Tommy's increasingly erratic behavior. During those final months, "People are talking," Harold saying that biker had gang colors that you might have put yourself in danger, Peterson said, his voice barely audible over the whir of the paint mixer. And Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized that his neighbors saw his compassion not as virtue but as foolishness. The morning routine that had once brought him peace, organizing inventory, mixing custom colors, helping customers find exactly what they needed, now felt hollow and strange, as if he were performing the motions of a life that no longer quite fit. While outside the store windows, Millbrook continued its daily rhythm, with Harold Mitchell existing somehow apart from it, marked by an act of mercy that his own community couldn't understand. The third day brought with it the distant rumble of thunder, except the sky remained cloudless and blue, and the sound grew steadily louder until Harold realized it wasn't weather, but engines, dozens of them approaching from the east like mechanical locusts. Through the store's front window, he watched the first motorcycle appear around the bend, followed by another, then another, until a procession of gleaming Harley-Davidsons rolled down Main Street with the measured precision of a funeral cortege, their riders wearing leather vests identical to the one Marcus had worn during their roadside meeting 3 days earlier. The procession of motorcycles moved down Main Street like a river of chrome and leather, their engines creating a symphony of mechanical thunder that rattled storefront windows and set Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias trembling in their planters. Harold watched from behind the hardware store's front counter as 24 Hells Angels rolled past Murphy's diner, the barber shop, and the tiny post office. Their formation so precise it resembled a military parade more than the chaotic gang arrival the townsfolk had whispered about in fearful tones. Each rider bore the same distinctive patches Harold had noticed on Marcus's vest. The winged skull that made police chief Patterson's face drain of color as he peered through his office window, recognizing symbols that carried weight. Far beyond Millbrook's quiet borders, the motorcycles came to a synchronized stop, directly in front of Miller's Hardware, their engines growling in unison before falling silent with an abruptness that made the sudden quiet feel more ominous than the roar had been. And Harold felt his heart hammering against his ribs, like a caged bird as he watched Marcus dismount from the lead bike, his left arm still bandaged, but his movements carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. "Harold Mitchell," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the afternoon air with the clarity of a church bell. And Harold felt every eye on Main Street turned toward the hardware store as he stepped through the front door, his work apron still tied around his waist, paint-stained fingers trembling slightly as he wiped them clean out of habit. The street had transformed into something resembling a Western movie set with curious faces pressed against shop windows, while others brave enough to venture outside maintained careful distances, their bodies tense with the kind of anticipation that precedes either celebration or catastrophe. Marcus removed his sunglasses with deliberate slowness, revealing eyes that had softened considerably since their roadside meeting. And Harold noticed how the other bikers formed a loose semicircle behind their leader, not threatening, but clearly unified like wolves protecting their pack leader while he conducted important business. "This man," Marcus announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent street, showed mercy to a stranger when he had no reason to expect anything but trouble in return, asked for nothing, wanted nothing, and probably saved my life when I was too proud and too hurt to ask for help. The applause began, slowly, just Marcus clapping his hands together with the measured rhythm of respect, but it spread through the assembled bikers until 24 pairs of weathered hands created a sound like distant thunder rolling across the plains. Harold stood transfixed, watching these men whose society had taught him to fear, expressing gratitude with the solemnity of a religious ceremony, their faces showing emotions he'd never expected to see beneath the leather and chrome exterior, genuine appreciation, brotherhood, and something that looked remarkably like the same vulnerability Marcus had shown during those moments on the roadside. From her hiding spot behind the diner's curtains, Dolores Murphy felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in Millbrook's quiet history. While Chief Patterson slowly holstered the weapon he'd instinctively reached for, understanding that whatever was happening on Main Street bore no resemblance to the violence he'd expected, Marcus reached into his leather jacket and withdrew something small and gleaming, a polished medallion that caught the afternoon sunlight like a promise, and extended it toward Harold with the ceremony of a knight offering tribute to a king, the simple gesture carrying weight that transcended the boundaries between their vastly different worlds. Harold's fingers closed around the medallion, feeling its surprising warmth and the intricate details carved into its surface, a brotherhood symbol that would ensure his safety anywhere in the country where Hell's Angels rode. A token of respect that transformed a simple act of roadside kindness into something approaching legend. The metal felt substantial in his palm, heavier than its size suggested, carrying the weight of protection and honor from men who'd learned to trust carefully and love fiercely, who understood that loyalty once earned became as permanent as scars and twice as meaningful. "Where I come from," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the gentle tone Harold remembered from their first meeting. "We don't forget the people who show us humanity when the rest of the world sees only our reputation. And we don't leave debts of gratitude unpaid." The words hung in the afternoon air like incense, sacred and binding, while the assembled townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places with expressions shifting from fear to wonder. understanding they were witnessing something their small community would talk about for generations. The moment when Harold Mitchell's simple compassion bridged two worlds that should never have touched. The motorcycles roared back to life with a sound like controlled lightning, engines synchronized in a final salute. Before the formation began moving again, rolling past the Barber H shop where old men nodded with newfound respect, past Murphy's diner where Dolores wiped tears from her eyes with her coffee-stained apron, past the post office where mail carriers would spread this story to every rural route in 3 counties. Marcus was the last to leave, pausing beside his Harley to meet Harold's eyes one final time, and in that moment of connection, both men understood they'd been changed by their encounter. Marcus, reminded that kindness still existed beyond his brotherhood. Harold reminded that courage sometimes meant simply seeing another person's humanity when the world insisted on seeing only their labels. The procession disappeared around the bend toward Highway 34, leaving behind only the settling dust, the lingering scent of leather and motor oil, and a town transformed by the realization that their quiet neighbor possessed depths they'd never suspected. As evening settled over Millbrook like a comfortable quilt, Harold stood in front of Miller's Hardware, holding the medallion up to catch the last rays of sunlight, watching it gleam like a small star in his weathered palm. The street had returned to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in the way his neighbors looked at him, not with the suspicious concern of the past 3 days, but with a mixture of awe and respect that reminded Harold of how people had looked at his father after the old man had pulled the Jenkins family from their burning farmhouse 40 years ago. Tommy would have been proud, Harold thought, remembering how his son had always admired people who stood up for what was right regardless of consequences, who chose compassion over safety, kindness over judgment. The medallion caught the fading light one more time before Harold slipped it into his shirt pocket close to his heart, where it would remain as a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of courage happen not in grand gestures witnessed by crowds, but in the quiet moments when one human being chooses to help another, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing they've added a small measure of mercy to a world that desperately needs it. And that evening, Harold Mitchell walked home along the same highway where his simple act of kindness had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed what happened when worlds collide and humanity bridges the gap that fear